It's kind of wild, right? Like we have these super advanced AIs that can write poems and hold conversations and even generate crazy realistic images. But get this, many of them struggle with something as simple as counting how many objects are in a picture, especially if that picture's really detailed.
It really does seem counterintuitive. You'd think counting would be easy, right?
Exactly. But it turns out this weakness actually reveals something really fundamental about how these AIs see the world.
It all comes down to the way they encode visual information, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
We're talking about large multimodal models, or LMMs, the AIs that can process both text and images. And as always, huge thanks to you, our awesome listeners. You pointed us to some really groundbreaking research in this area, and we're excited to break it down together.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing on a specific research paper called LLaVA UHD, an LMM perceiving any aspect ratio in high-resolution images, as well as some of the findings related to models like GPT-4V and LLaVA 1.5 that are discussed in that paper.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start with the basics. Why is this whole visual encoding thing so crucial for LMMs?
Well, imagine trying to understand a conversation in a language you don't speak. It's going to be pretty tough, right?
Yeah, you might pick up a few words here and there, but you'd be missing most of the meaning.
Exactly. It's the same with LMMs. They're amazing at understanding and generating text, but raw image data, it's just a bunch of pixels to them. Visual encoding is essentially the process of translating that pixel information into a language that the large language model, part of the LMM, can actually understand.
Okay, so it's like giving the AI a visual dictionary to make sense of what it's seeing.
That's a great way to put it. And the quality of that visual encoding, it directly affects how well the LMM can perform all sorts of tasks, from answering questions about an image to generating descriptions or even recognizing objects.
So a good visual encoding, clear and accurate, is the foundation for everything else the LMM does with that image.
Precisely. And historically, the visual encoding strategies used in many LMMs have been pretty simplistic. They've been designed to handle images with fixed aspect ratios, often squares, and at relatively low resolutions.
So like those tiny thumbnail images you see online.
Exactly. And while that simplification might work for some basic tasks, it creates a bunch of problems when you're dealing with the complexity of real-world images.
Because real-world images, they come in all shapes and sizes. You've got wide landscapes, tall portraits, images packed with tons of tiny details.
Right, and trying to cram those diverse images into a fixed square format at low resolution, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You end up with distortions, you lose important details. It's just not an ideal way to represent the visual world.
And I imagine that has a knock-on effect on the LMM's ability to actually understand what it's seeing.
Absolutely. You get shape distortions because you're essentially stretching or squeezing the image to fit that predetermined square frame. You get blurriness because you're reducing the resolution and losing those fine details. And all of that can lead to errors. The AI might miss small objects. It might misinterpret text within the image. It might even hallucinate things that aren't really there because it's working with incomplete visual information.
So it's not seeing the full picture, literally. But then the question is, why not just feed these models high-resolution images in their original aspect ratios?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. There are a couple of major challenges. One is the issue of adaptivity. Many visual encoders, especially those based on architectures like CAPVIT, they're pre-trained on massive data sets of images. But those images usually have those fixed resolutions and aspect ratios we talked about. So suddenly feeding them something drastically different can throw them off. It's like trying to teach someone who's only ever read children's books to analyze a complex legal document.
Their brain just wouldn't be wired for it.
Yeah, exactly. And the second major hurdle is efficiency. Processing high-resolution images, especially with those vision transformers that are becoming so popular in LMMs, it can be computationally very expensive. You see, those transformers, they analyze an image by comparing every part of it to every other part. So as you increase the resolution, the number of those comparisons explodes.
So it's not just a little more work, it's exponentially more work.
Right. And all of that extra computation, it takes time, it takes energy, and it can quickly become a bottleneck, especially if you want to use these LMMs in real-time applications.
Okay, so we've got the context, we understand why this visual encoding step is so important, and we see the challenges of moving to higher resolutions and more natural aspect ratios. Now let's dig into the research you mentioned. You said this paper uncovered some surprising weaknesses in existing LMMs, even some of the big names out there. Let's start with GPT-4V. What did they find?
Well, the researchers used a clever approach to probe GPT-4V's visual capabilities. They created synthetic images, very simple, controlled images specifically to test its ability to count objects. Imagine an image with just 4 circles, and they systematically move those circles around to different positions within the image frame.
Okay, so a very basic visual counting task. Did GPT-4V ace it?
Not exactly. They found that GPT-4V's accuracy actually varied depending on where those circles were located within the image. The most accurate counts came when the circles were in the central square of the image, but when they were positioned in the middle edges, the count was often lower than it should have been, and in the corners, that's where the answers were closest to the actual number.
So it's like the AI has some weird blind spots or areas of greater clarity within its visual field.
It's really strange, isn't it? And it gets even more intriguing. The researchers noticed that many of the incorrect answers involved doubling or even quadrupling the actual number of objects. And that's what led them to their hypothesis about how GPT-4V might be handling these higher resolution images. OpenAI has mentioned that in its high-resolution mode, GPT-4V breaks down images into a series of 512 by 512 pixel slices.
Okay, so it's dividing the image into smaller chunks to process them.
Right. But the researchers suspect that when an image's dimensions aren't perfectly divisible by 512, those slices might overlap. And if a circle, for example, happens to fall within an area where 2 slices overlap, it could get counted twice. And the worst-case scenario, if it's at a point where 4 slices overlap, you could end up with a count of 4 times the actual number.
So the overlapping slices could explain those doubled and quadrupled counts depending on where the objects are in the image. That's an interesting theory.
And to test it further, they did another experiment where they gradually increased the resolution of the input image. And they observed these fascinating phase changes in GPT-4V's responses.
Phase changes, like the AI's answers suddenly shifted in a noticeable way.
Yeah, exactly. At lower resolutions, where the image likely fit within a single 512 by 512 slice, GPT-4V got the count mostly right. But as the resolution increased, they saw this sudden jump where the answer 12 became dominant. And they believe this might be because parts of those circles were now falling into multiple slices, leading to overcounting. Then, at even higher resolutions, they got this mix of answers, including some correct ones, some 12s, and quite a few 16s, which really supports the idea that those 4 overlapping slices might be causing a count of 4 objects to be interpreted as 16.
Wow, so even something as seemingly basic as counting reveals these potential vulnerabilities in how GPT-4V is processing high-resolution images. And it's not just about getting the wrong answer, it's about these systematic errors that hint at a deeper issue.
Absolutely. And these findings, they highlight the importance of really understanding how these models are handling visual information, especially as we push them towards even higher resolutions.
Okay, so that's GPT-4V. What about LLaVA 1.5? You said that model uses a different approach and has its own set of challenges.
Right, so LLaVA 1.5, it deals with non-square images by adding gray padding around them to make them fit into a square shape before feeding them to its visual encoder.
Padding, so it's basically adding blank space around the actual image content.
Precisely. And while that might seem like a straightforward solution, it turns out the LLaVA 1.5 doesn't always do a great job of distinguishing this padding from the real content of the image. And that leads to a couple of problems. First, it's computationally wasteful because the model is processing all those extra padding pixels that don't actually contain any useful information. But more importantly, it can actually impair the model's understanding of the image.
Because it's trying to make sense of meaningless blank space along with the actual image.
Exactly. The researchers tested this by showing LLaVA 1.5 colored rectangles with various aspect ratios surrounded by this gray padding. And when they have questions like, what color is the leftmost area of the image? LLaVA 1.5 consistently ignored the padding and only focused on the color of the central rectangle.
So it's essentially blind to parts of its input because it can't properly differentiate the padding from the real image. That doesn't sound very robust.
Not at all. And interestingly, when the researchers trained a version of LLaVA 1.5 that could handle different aspect ratios directly without any padding, they saw improvements in performance on certain tasks, suggesting that padding really is holding it back in some ways.
Okay, so to sum up our exploration of these two popular models, both GPT-4V with its slicing and potential overcounting, and LLaVA 1.5 with its padding and blindness to certain areas, they both exhibit these systematic weaknesses in how they handle images. And these weaknesses aren't just theoretical. They can lead to real errors and limitations in the AI's ability to understand what it's seeing.
Exactly. And these findings underscore the need for more sophisticated visual encoding strategies that can handle the diversity and complexity of real-world images. And that's where LLaVA UHD comes in.
LLaVA UHD. This is the model that's specifically designed to address these challenges, right? Tell us about it.
LLaVA UHD is built to efficiently perceive images with any aspect ratio at high resolutions without those limitations we've been discussing. It incorporates three key innovations that work together to achieve this. The first is image modularization. Instead of using fixed-size slices or padding, LLaVA UHD intelligently divides the original image into smaller slices, but crucially, those slices can be variable in size.
Variable size slices, so it's not trying to force the image into a predetermined grid.
Exactly. The paper uses a great analogy to illustrate this. Imagine trying to fill containers of different shapes with either water drops or rigid ice cubes. With ice cubes, you'll inevitably end up with gaps, or you'll have to break them apart, which isn't ideal. But water drops, they can perfectly conform to the shape of any container, filling it completely without any wasted space.
Okay, so the ice cubes are like those fixed-size processing methods, and the water drops are like LLaVA UHD's variable-sized slices. That's a really helpful analogy.
Glad it makes sense. So with LLaVA UHD, you get this adaptable, efficient way to break down the image into chunks that the visual encoder can handle more effectively.
But how does it decide how many slices to create and what the dimensions of those slices should be? It seems like that could get pretty complicated.
It is quite sophisticated. LLaVA UHD starts by calculating an ideal number of slices based on the input image resolution and some parameters related to its underlying visual encoder. Then it explores various ways to partition the image into that number of slices, considering different arrangements of rows and columns. And to determine the best partition, it uses a scoring function that essentially measures how well the aspect ratios of those potential slices match what the visual encoder was initially trained on.
So it's trying to find the best balance between having enough slices to handle the resolution and making sure those slices aren't too weirdly shaped.
Precisely. And they've even got this theoretical guarantee that even for really extreme aspect ratios, like a super wide panorama or a very tall portrait, the slices will stay within reasonable bounds.
So no matter how strangely shaped the original image is, the slices will still be manageable for the visual encoder. That's pretty clever. What's the second innovation you mentioned?
The second key component is the compression module. Once the visual encoder has processed those variable-sized slices, it spits out a set of image tokens representing the visual information in each slice. But for high-resolution images, you can still end up with a ton of these tokens, which can be a computational nightmare for the language model. So, LLaVA UHD uses a special layer called a perceiver resampler to condense those tokens down to a fixed number, regardless of the original image resolution.
A fixed number of tokens, no matter how detailed the image is. How does that work?
The perceiver resampler is like a smart summarizer. It uses these learned query vectors that selectively pay attention to the most important parts of the input tokens. It's a more intelligent way to compress information compared to those simpler methods that just apply a fixed mathematical transformation.
So it's not just blindly throwing away information, it's picking out the most relevant bits to keep.
Exactly. And this leads to some really impressive efficiency gains. The paper shows that LLaVA UHD can actually process a fairly high-resolution image, something like 672 by 1008 pixels, with less computational cost than LLaVA 1.5 needs for a much smaller image, all thanks to this clever compression.
That's a really significant improvement. And what about the third innovation you mentioned, the spatial schema? What's that all about?
Well, remember how LLaVA UHD breaks the image down into these variable-sized slices? The spatial schema is essentially a way to tell the language model how those slices were originally arranged in the image. It's like giving it a map of the image structure.
So it's not just feeding the LLM a jumble of visual tokens. It's saying, hey, this slice was next to this one, and this one was below that one, and so on.
Exactly. And it does this using special tokens. They use a comma to separate tokens from slices within the same row, and a new line character to indicate the start of a new row. It's a simple but really effective way to convey that spatial information to the LLM.
Okay, so those are the three key innovations.
Yeah.
The modularization, the compression, and the spatial schema. They all work together to create this more adaptable and efficient way to process high-resolution images. But the real question is, how does all of this translate into actual performance?
Well, the researchers put LLaVA UHD through its paces on a variety of standard benchmarks, and the results are really quite impressive.
Like, how impressive?
Across 9 different benchmarks, LLaVA UHD consistently outperformed a range of other strong models, including some that were trained on vastly larger datasets and others that were specifically designed for high-resolution images.
So it's not just holding its own, it's actually beating out the competition, even models with significant advantages in terms of data or computational resources.
Exactly. And it's not just a marginal improvement either. On benchmarks like Text VQA, which involves reading and understanding text within images, and POPE, which evaluates how prone a model is to hallucinating objects, LLaVA UHD showed substantial gains over its LLaVA 1.5 predecessor. And the researchers believe that much of this improvement can be attributed to its ability to handle those finer details that are often lost in low-resolution processing.
So it's really about seeing more clearly, understanding more deeply. And you mentioned earlier that LLaVA UHD is also much more efficient.
Right. It can process images that are 6 times larger in resolution than LLaVA 1.5 while using only slightly less computation. That's a huge win in terms of both capability and efficiency.
It sounds like LLaVA UHD really is pushing the boundaries of what's possible in AI vision.
I think so. The paper also delves into some detailed analysis to understand the contributions of each component of LLaVA UHD. They did what's called ablation studies, where they systematically remove or alter different parts of the model to see how it affects performance.
So, like taking the engine out of a car to see how far it can roll.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
In these ablation studies, they really highlight the importance of each piece of the puzzle. Just replacing LLaVA 1.5's padding strategy with LLaVA UHD's adaptive slicing led to noticeable improvements, demonstrating the benefits of handling different aspect ratios directly. The perceiver resampler was shown to be both more effective and far more efficient than simpler compression methods. And removing the spatial schema caused a significant drop in performance, confirming its essential role in helping the LLM understand the image structure.
So every piece of the puzzle matters.
Absolutely. And the researchers also explored how LLaVA UHD performs on images with those extreme aspect ratios we talked about earlier, like super wide panoramas or tall portraits. And because LLaVA UHD processes images in their native aspect ratios, it avoids those distortions that plague models using fixed aspect ratios. And that translates into a clear performance advantage.
So it's not just good at handling typical images, it's especially well suited to those more challenging cases. That's really impressive.
It is. And they even looked at how fine-tuning the visual encoder during different stages of training affected performance. Interestingly, they found that just fine-tuning it during the instruction tuning phase, where the model learns to follow instructions, was sufficient. And freezing the visual encoder's parameters during the initial pre-training phase actually works slightly better, probably due to some stability issues that can arise when you try to train these massive models from scratch on limited data.
So that's a valuable insight for anyone working on similar models. You don't necessarily need to retrain everything from the ground up, which can save a lot of time and computational resources.
Absolutely. And to really illustrate the practical benefits of LLaVA UHD, the paper includes some great qualitative examples showing side-by-side comparisons with LLaVA 1.5 on real-world images. For example, when asked to extract information from a dense timetable, LLaVA UHD correctly identifies the relevant details, while LLaVA 1.5 gives a much more general and less useful answer.
So it's not just about passing benchmarks. It's about actually being able to understand and interpret real-world visual information more accurately.
Exactly. And in another example, LLaVA UHD successfully reads small, low-contrast text on a poster that LLaVA 1.5 struggles to decipher. And when looking at a phone screen displaying a weather report, LLaVA UHD accurately describes the details, while LLaVA 1.5 gives a less precise or even incorrect answer. These examples really showcase the power of LLaVA UHD's enhanced visual perception.
So it's a significant leap forward in how AI can see and understand the world. But as with any cutting-edge research, there are always limitations and areas for future exploration. What are the researchers focusing on next?
They acknowledge that the current LLaVA UHD model has a resolution limit. It can handle pretty high-resolution images, but they want to push that even further in the future, exploring applications with 4K imagery and even incredibly detailed satellite images.
So even higher resolution, even more detailed visual understanding.
Right. And they're also looking at ways to improve how the model processes global context. Right now, each image slice is encoded somewhat independently. They want to find more efficient ways to connect those slices and allow for information sharing between them so the model can develop a more holistic understanding of the entire image.
So it's not just about seeing each piece, it's about putting those pieces together to get the full picture.
That's a great way to put it, and I think those are really exciting directions for future research, potentially leading to even more powerful and capable LMMs.
Okay, so let's wrap things up for our amazing listeners. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the intricacies of visual encoding in LMMs, the surprising weaknesses of some existing models, and the exciting potential of this new approach called LLaVA UHD. What are the key takeaways from all of this?
The key takeaway is that even in the rapidly advancing field of AI, there are still fundamental challenges when it comes to truly understanding visual information, especially at high resolutions and with the diversity of aspect ratios we encounter in the real world.
But LLaVA UHD provides a really promising path forward.
Absolutely. Through its innovative approach to image modularization, compression, and spatial awareness, LLaVA UHD addresses many of those fundamental limitations, enabling it to process high-resolution images with any aspect ratio far more efficiently and accurately than existing methods. And the experimental results are truly impressive, showing significant gains in performance across a variety of challenging tasks, particularly those requiring a detailed understanding of visual information.
And for you, our listeners, who are always eager to learn and explore, this deep dive highlights the fact that even in seemingly advanced areas of AI, there are still breakthroughs happening, new frontiers being explored, and a constant push towards more robust and capable systems. The ability of AI to see and interpret the visual world is rapidly evolving, and it's an area with far-reaching implications for countless applications that you might be following.
And that brings us to a thought-provoking question for you to ponder.
Yeah.
How might this enhanced ability for AI to process high-resolution images without distortion impact fields like medical imaging, where the accurate analysis of detailed scans is so critical? How could it revolutionize environmental monitoring, enabling us to extract more meaningful insights from complex satellite imagery? What new possibilities might open up when AI can truly perceive the world as we do in all its rich detail and complexity? It's an exciting future to contemplate.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.